Today, we are going to look at the worst deaths ever recorded. From a woman who went for a hike only for her life to be taken away in a blink of an eye, to setting a world record ending in a horrifying sight. On May 7, 2017, the South District of Shenandoah National Park was still drying out from a storm that had moved through the night before. The ground was soft, small pools of water lined the trail edges, and several narrow paths showed signs of recent runoff. By mid-morning, the sky cleared and temperatures rose into the mid-60s, drawing day hikers onto the lower elevation routes. 32-year-old Hannah Rojas arrived at the Jones Run trailhead shortly before 10 a.m. She had recently joined a local hiking meetup group and volunteered to scout potential routes for an upcoming beginner outing. Jones Run was one of the trails she wanted to check that week. She wasn't rushing or trying to fit the walk into a tight schedule. She simply chose this morning because it was the first clear window after several days of work and rain. She carried only what she needed for a short inspection: water, a folded map, and a windbreaker tied around her waist. Her plan was to walk the lower section, note any muddy spots or blocked areas, and decide whether it was suitable for new hikers after the recent storm. At about 10:50 a.m., two older hikers heading downhill passed her. She appeared to be checking the next junction, and they continued on without noticing anything unusual. Not long after that point, the Jones Run Trail reached the split where a narrow connector branched off toward the main loop farther north. Spring growth partly covered the wooden post marking the intersection. A temporary warning sign about erosion had been placed there the previous evening, but by morning it had tipped sideways against low branches and was no longer positioned where someone approaching from Hannah's direction would clearly see it. Footprints found later showed that Hannah followed the connector. The route was visibly narrower than Jones Run, but the tread looked intact from the entrance. The first few hundred feet showed only minor erosion: soft sections of soil, a few puddles, and small runoff channels created by the overnight storm. As she continued, the connector began to angle along a hillside that had absorbed most of the storm's rainfall. Soil along certain edges had loosened and separated from the firmer ground above. Rangers later noted that from the trail surface, the compromised area appeared solid enough to walk on, especially in dim morning light. 15 minutes after hikers last saw her, a man traveling well below the slope heard a short, sharp sound from somewhere upslope, either a loose rock or a brief cry. He paused and listened, but nothing followed. In that part of the forest, falling branches and shifting debris after storms were common, so he resumed his walk. The next day, rangers inspecting the connector found the evidence of what had happened. A section of the slope had collapsed, leaving a narrow, uneven edge between the remaining trail and the steep drop into the drainage below. A single boot print sat directly on the weakened soil. Everything beneath that print had fallen away, taking the outer portion of the trail with it. Slide marks traced the short fall 6 to 8 feet before stopping on a muddy ledge. The ledge showed handprints and disturbed dirt, indicating Hannah briefly halted there, but the ledge itself had loosened during the storm. When she tried to shift her weight or stand, the remaining soil broke apart. From that point, the slope steepened sharply for about 20 feet. Scratched branches and torn vegetation showed the path of her slide, ending near a small stream channel where a broken sapling held a piece of blue fabric matching the color of her windbreaker. The location was hidden from most angles. Dense mountain laurel along the drainage blocked sightlines, and the slope shape directed sound downward rather than outward. Hikers passing on the main trail overhead would not have been able to see or hear much from below. It was February 3, 2018, when the frozen wilderness of Lake Superior would become the final resting place for one of Minnesota's most dedicated underwater photographers. Kellen Shaw, a 36-year-old professional photographer from Duluth, had spent years perfecting his craft in the unforgiving cold waters of the Great Lakes. With 920 log dives and specialized cold water certifications, Shaw was known for his breathtaking images of ice formations and frozen lake ecosystems. However, his perfectionist nature often drove him to dangerous extremes, frequently extending dive times beyond safe limits in pursuit of the perfect shot. Shaw had planned this solo ice diving expedition to photograph unique frozen formations on Lake Superior's bottom during the harsh Minnesota winter. The lake's surface was locked under 18 inches of solid ice, requiring him to chainsaw entry and exit holes through the frozen barrier. Water temperature measured a bone-chilling 34 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected diver within minutes. His dive plan called for 15 minutes of bottom time at 80 feet. Shaw's dry suit had developed small leaks in the wrist seals over months of use, a critical equipment failure he noticed during pre-dive checks, but chose to ignore rather than delay his expedition. Air temperature had plummeted to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with 20-knot winds creating brutal wind chill factors of minus 45 degrees. Shaw's surface support consisted of his inexperienced girlfriend, who lacked any emergency training. This violated fundamental ice diving safety protocols, requiring trained surface support personnel. Even more dangerously, Shaw failed to properly attach his safety line, the critical lifeline that would guide him back to the entry hole under solid ice. His dive computer displayed low battery warnings during final equipment checks, but Shaw's obsession with capturing perfect photographs overrode his safety judgment. He decided to proceed rather than delay for battery replacement, eliminating his primary source of depth, time, and navigation information. Shaw entered the frigid water and began his descent. At 10 minutes into the dive, his dry suit wrist seals failed completely, allowing a surge of 34-degree water to flush into the suit and trigger immediate cold shock breathing panic. The freezing water sent him into uncontrollable gasping, and in the chaos, he lost buoyancy control, sinking past his planned depth. His dive computer failed completely due to battery exhaustion, leaving him without depth, time, or navigation information in the dark underwater environment. Disorientation and numbness set in quickly as cold shock transitioned into early hypothermia, making it harder for him to use his equipment properly. Confusion clouded his judgment, while loss of fine motor control made it impossible to operate equipment properly. His regulator began free-flowing due to ice crystal formation, rapidly depleting his air supply. The safety line that should have guided Shaw back had never been properly clipped to his harness, leaving him without navigation reference under the solid ice sheet. As hypothermia advanced, his hands became completely numb, preventing him from operating his BCD inflator or emergency signaling devices. Shaw attempted to surface, but became completely disoriented under the impenetrable ice barrier. Hypothermia-induced confusion made it impossible to locate the entry hole, and he began swimming in circles beneath the frozen surface. His body temperature continued dropping to critical levels, triggering cardiac arrhythmia. At around 40 feet, Shaw finally lost consciousness as cold incapacitation and oxygen deprivation overwhelmed him. The combination of severe hypothermia and cardiac arrest proved instantly lethal. He drowned while floating motionless under the ice sheet, his body drifting 200 feet from the entry hole, while his untrained surface support waited unknowingly above. Recovery operations required specialized ice rescue teams working in extremely dangerous conditions. It took 4 grueling hours to locate Shaw's body in the dark, frigid water beneath the ice. Medical examination revealed he had died from drowning, complicated by severe hypothermia and cardiac arrest. Investigation uncovered that Shaw had violated multiple ice diving safety protocols, including solo diving without proper surface support and failure to secure his safety line. His death prompted stricter equipment inspection standards and mandatory hypothermia prevention training programs. On March 3, 2018, a regional winter sport event took place on the Vatnajökull glacier in Iceland. The morning began with steady cold air moving across the open ice, and temperatures sat in the low 20s degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility was good, with a light overcast sky that gave the glacier a flat, pale look. The wind stayed mild at first, creating a calm atmosphere around the starting area, where competitors checked their gear and waited for their group assignments. The competition was a mixed-discipline winter challenge that included distance snowshoeing, a timed ice corridor speed section, and a final uphill route leading toward the ridge. The layout spread across several natural features of the glacier, and the wide-open ice fields around the start line made it easy for officials to organize participants. Although the event wasn't professional, it drew skilled hobby athletes from around the country. People used to training outdoors in winter and comfortable moving across uneven ice. One of the registered participants was Hildur Sveinsdóttir, a 55-year-old retired schoolteacher from Akureyri. She had completed similar winter races in past years and was known for keeping a steady pace rather than racing aggressively. Event staff checked her gear at the starting line. Standard snowshoes, helmet, layered clothing, and safety spikes for the ice corridor portion. The race began in cold but stable weather. The snowshoe segment went smoothly, with competitors spaced out along the marked path. Hildur stayed in the middle group of racers, never falling far behind. The next part of the course led into a natural ice corridor carved over time by meltwater and shifting wind patterns. Event organizers used that corridor every winter, since its walls stayed thick and firm when temperatures remained low. 7 racers entered the corridor together, along with one official positioned near the entrance to monitor spacing. 2 racers behind Hildur had a clear view of her as the group moved forward. The corridor was narrow enough that competitors walked single file, and a frozen overhang hung above parts of the ceiling. The floor was a polished layer of ice, marked occasionally by traction scratches from earlier runs. A small tremor had been recorded early that morning, nothing unusual for Iceland, but minor ground shifts sometimes caused loose ice to crack. Officials noted it in their report, but found no immediate hazards during their inspection. As the group reached a tight bend inside the corridor, the incident began. Without warning, a slab of ice broke away from the right-hand wall. Several racers later told staff they heard a sharp cracking sound 1 second before it fell. The slab dropped at an angle, heavy enough to break into smaller pieces once it hit the floor. Hildur reacted by stepping backward, likely to avoid the falling piece. Her boot slid across a slick patch on the floor, and she lost her balance. She fell into a shallow recess formed naturally along the wall. At the same moment, the largest section of the slab continued its downward movement and pressed her into the recess. The 2 racers behind her heard her shout and saw that the slab had pinned her at the waist. They called out to the event official, who was still near the entrance, and attempted to move closer. But the corridor was too narrow to reach her quickly without risking additional collapse. Small cracks spread across the wall where the slab had broken off, and loose fragments continued to settle. The official instructed everyone to stay clear of the unstable section. He approached only close enough to assess the situation, but did not attempt to pull the slab away, since pushing it could trigger more breaks. From his position, it was clear that Hildur could not move. The slab's weight pressed firmly against the ledge behind her, and each shift caused more compression. For several minutes, the group stayed inside the corridor without moving, waiting for the ice around them to settle. Small cracks continued to shift along the wall, and the guide instructed everyone to remain still to avoid triggering more collapses. Once the chamber finally stabilized, he directed the racers to exit the corridor slowly, one at a time, making sure they kept as much distance as possible from the damaged section. Hildur remained pinned in the recess, while the others moved to a safer open area outside the bend. After the group reached stable ground, the guide returned to assess her situation from a secure angle where the wall showed no signs of further cracking. From that view, he could see that the slab had pressed directly across her lower torso and pelvis, trapping her against the ledge behind her with a force heavy enough to stop circulation and restrict breathing. The pressure had also compressed her chest and abdomen, injuries that often lead to rapid loss of consciousness. Based on the lack of movement and the position of her body, the guide confirmed that Hildur had died from severe crush injuries caused by the weight of the ice slab. The impact and pressure were significant enough that survival would not have been possible once she was pinned. The winter event ended immediately. Race organizers closed the entire glacier course and suspended the ice corridor segment indefinitely, while staff re-evaluated its stability for future competitions. It was March 8, 2015, when an Olympic training pool in Colorado Springs became the site of a tragedy that would forever change perceptions of extreme human endurance records and the dangerous pursuit of physiological limits. Eleanor King, 29, a former swimmer from Portland, Oregon, had transitioned from competitive swimming to static apnea following her swimming career. What set Eleanor apart was her methodical scientific approach to training that had made her a respected figure in the breath-holding record community. Her meticulous documentation of training sessions had earned her recognition among researchers studying human aquatic adaptation. The Olympic Training Center had become Eleanor's second home over the past 6 months. Working with pulmonologist Dr. James Wright, a volunteer consultant specializing in extreme physiology, she had developed an intensive regimen that tested the limits of human respiratory physiology. Her coach, Maria Santos, was a former world record holder who understood the delicate balance between peak performance and dangerous overreach. Her target was ambitious: 9 minutes and 45 seconds of static apnea, following standard AIDA protocols. This would surpass the existing women's record by 30 seconds, establishing her as the premier female breath-holding record holder. Eleanor would remain face down while safety spotters monitored her continuously. The support team represented the gold standard of breath-holding safety protocols. Dr. Wright provided comprehensive medical supervision, Maria offered technical guidance based on decades of experience, and Tom Bradley, a certified lifeguard and paramedic, stood ready with rescue equipment, including oxygen delivery systems and defibrillation capabilities. At 2:15 p.m., Eleanor began her final preparations with the precision that had characterized her entire record-breaking career. The pool environment was carefully controlled for water temperature and lighting. She wore a wetsuit and nose clip, while safety spotters took positions at the pool edge, and one diver remained close in the water, ready to intervene. The early stages proceeded exactly as planned. For the first 4 minutes, Eleanor remained completely motionless, her body exhibiting the classic mammalian diving response that slowed her heart rate to 35 beats per minute. This adaptation allows humans to conserve oxygen by redirecting blood flow to essential organs. At 5 minutes and 30 seconds, Eleanor began experiencing involuntary diaphragmatic contractions, signaling rising carbon dioxide levels. These contractions are normal during extended breath holds and were well within her extensive training experience. The critical phase began at 8 minutes and 30 seconds. Eleanor's peripheral movements became slightly irregular, and post-event monitoring data reviewed by medical staff suggested her blood oxygen saturation had fallen into dangerously low ranges, approaching the danger zone that separates record achievement from life-threatening hypoxia. At 9 minutes and 43 seconds, just 2 seconds before her record target, Eleanor lost motor control and suffered a hypoxic blackout as her brain oxygen levels became critically low. The safety team acted immediately, turning her supine and clearing her airway, but she had already inhaled a small amount of water. Despite rapid resuscitation efforts and immediate emergency medical intervention, Eleanor could not be revived. Prolonged oxygen deprivation caused irreversible brain injury. At 3:47 p.m., Eleanor King was pronounced dead at the local hospital. The investigation revealed the hidden danger that had claimed Eleanor's life. Investigators later determined that her training included aggressive pre-ventilation techniques designed to reduce carbon dioxide levels. While this practice can extend breath-holding time, it eliminates the body's natural warning system that signals when oxygen levels become dangerously low. Her death prompted renewed debate within the competitive breath-holding community and updated safety recommendations at the elite level. Real-time blood oxygen monitoring was strongly recommended for elite-level record attempts, and stricter guidelines were established for pre-breathing techniques. It was February 12, 2016. And the narrow hallway of a 3-bedroom apartment in Denver, Colorado, lay dimly lit in the evening hours. A single overhead bulb had burned out weeks earlier, leaving only the ambient glow from nearby rooms to illuminate the cramped passage. The carpeted floor showed the wear patterns of daily foot traffic, and the walls bore the typical scuff marks of furniture being moved through the tight space. 31-year-old Vancy Drubb had spent another long day processing paperwork at a downtown office building, her meticulous nature making her invaluable for organizing and maintaining detailed records. Known among her roommates for her obsessive cleanliness and inability to tolerate even minor clutter, Vancy had developed a reputation for immediately addressing any mess she encountered. Her physical fitness routine and active lifestyle kept her in excellent shape, though her perfectionist tendencies sometimes created tension in the shared living space. Earlier that evening, her roommates, frustrated with Vancy's constant complaints about housekeeping, had planned what they considered a harmless hidden camera prank inspired by viral tripline videos. They strung clear, high-tensile fishing line across the hallway at ankle height, roughly 8 inches above the floor, and positioned several pillows just beyond the nearly invisible barrier to cushion what they expected would be a minor stumble. To ensure the prank looked authentic, they carefully angled the cameras to capture her face, unaware of how quickly events could spiral out of control. The lighting worked in their favor. With the overhead bulb out and only indirect illumination filtering from adjacent rooms, the transparent line became virtually impossible to detect. Phones were set near door frames, ready to capture what they anticipated would be an embarrassing but harmless fall. Vancy returned home, carrying a 45-pound glass-top side table she had purchased from a coworker. The piece, featuring a heavy metal frame supporting a large, thick annealed decorative glass surface, completely blocked her view of the floor as she navigated the familiar hallway. The weight distribution made the item awkward to carry, requiring her to hold it at chest level to maintain balance. Her fingers gripped the metal edge tightly as she took careful steps, unaware of the hazard ahead. The fishing line caught both of her ankles simultaneously, creating sudden forward momentum that she could not control. The table struck the floor edge first with tremendous force, and the glass shattered violently against the metal frame. Instead of the soft landing her roommates had planned, Vancy fell directly onto the broken panel. As the table struck the floor, the annealed glass shattered, leaving a large, jagged section partially upright. Vancy fell forward onto the broken panel, and a sharp edge penetrated near her collarbone, severing major blood vessels in her neck and upper chest. Heavy arterial bleeding began immediately, creating a rapidly expanding pool on the hallway carpet. Her roommates, initially assuming she was exaggerating as part of the staged reaction, hesitated for several crucial seconds before realizing the severity of the situation. They attempted to apply pressure using towels and clothing, but the location and depth of the wound made effective compression nearly impossible. The bleeding continued at an alarming rate, and Vancy's responses became increasingly weak and incoherent. Emergency responders arrived to find no detectable pulse despite their rapid response time. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from catastrophic exsanguination due to penetrating glass trauma. Investigators documented the deliberate placement of the trip hazard and noted that the fishing line remained intact and properly positioned, confirming the intentional nature of the setup. The roommates faced local charges for negligent endangerment, though the death was ultimately classified as accidental traumatic injury directly caused by the prank. The case showed how a simple prank could turn fatal under the wrong conditions. Investigators noted that the roommates failed to account for how carrying a heavy object could dramatically increase the risk posed by the trip line. It was September 14, 2019, at a small private marina along the Gulf Coast of Florida. The morning tide had just begun to rise, lifting the moored boats in slow, steady increments. Wooden docks creaked against their pilings as gulls circled overhead. The air was already warm, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. Most slips were quiet at that hour, with only a few early owners walking the planks to check their vessels before the day's heat set in. Oliver Garland, 48, had co-managed the marina for nearly 15 years. He handled maintenance schedules, billing, and dock assignments. Regular clients trusted him, but over the past year, changes in his personal life had begun to surface in subtle ways. His wife, Jessica Garland, 30, had grown distant. She had married Oliver at 23 when he was already established and financially secure. By the time she turned 30, she had begun spending more time around the docks, especially near Slip 27, where Matt Jackson, 28, kept his 38-foot cruiser. Matt was 20 years younger than Oliver and had purchased his boat the previous spring, becoming a frequent presence at the marina. His growing closeness with Jessica soon became noticeable to staff. Oliver discovered their messages in July, and by August, Jessica told him she planned to leave and move in with Matt after filing for divorce. Friends later said Oliver appeared unusually composed during that conversation. Matt followed a predictable routine. On Saturdays, he arrived shortly after 7 a.m. to check his mooring lines and rinse the deck before taking Jessica out on the water. He preferred inspecting the lines himself, often stepping into the narrow space between the hull and dock as the tide shifted. Security footage showed Oliver walking the docks alone before sunrise on September 14th and stopping at Slip 27. By 7:18 a.m., Matt arrived. Jessica followed in her car minutes later. Witnesses recalled her laughing as she walked down the dock toward him. The tide had begun to strengthen, and a larger fishing vessel passing the marina entrance created a moderate wake that rippled inward. Matt stepped into the narrow gap between the dock and hull to check the boat's position. Jessica stood several feet away on the planks. As the wake reached slip 27, the boat shifted laterally. What would normally have been a restrained movement became a sudden surge inward. The hull pressed sharply toward the dock piling. Matt had no room to step back. The side of the vessel pinned him upright against the wooden structure. Witnesses described hearing a strained shout, followed by the heavy grinding sound of fiberglass against timber. Jessica moved toward him as others on the dock reacted. The pressure lasted only seconds, but the force was immense. When the vessel shifted back with the retreating wake, Matt collapsed onto the planks. Paramedics were called from a nearby station, but upon arrival, the injuries were assessed as immediately fatal. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death to be traumatic thoracic compression resulting in cardiac arrest. Multiple rib fractures and extensive internal hemorrhage were consistent with crushing between a fixed structure and a heavy vessel. Investigators reviewing dock footage noticed Oliver's early morning presence. Marine safety experts determined the line configuration at slip 27 had been intentionally adjusted in a manner inconsistent with standard securing practice. The tide schedule for that morning showed predictable lateral force during the incoming surge. When confronted, Oliver did not request an attorney. In a recorded statement, he admitted altering the lines. He told detectives he knew Matt's routine and understood how the boat would respond once the tide strengthened. Said he believed the marina environment would make the death appear accidental. He also acknowledged knowing Jessica would be there to see it. Oliver Garland was charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that he weaponized his professional knowledge and exploited predictable tidal movement to carry out the act. Jessica later testified regarding the separation and Oliver's reaction. A jury convicted him, and he received a life sentence without parole. On August 12, 2015, steady rain fell across the Hoh rainforest in Olympic National Park. The temperature stayed cool throughout the morning, and thin fog gathered between the tall trees. The Hoh River Trail was damp but passable, with the usual mix of day hikers and backpackers moving through at their own pace. Most visitors stayed on the marked path because side routes were slick from recent rainfall. That morning, 39-year-old Kara Howell, a part-time librarian from Tacoma, started a solo hike on the lower section of the trail. Friends later described how she usually used her quiet days to walk alone on short forest routes. She wasn't an overnight backpacker and didn't carry heavy gear. Her pack held basic items: a light jacket, water, a paper map, and an older phone that struggled to get a signal in the forest. Kara planned to walk a simple out-and-back section of the Hoh River Trail, a route she chose because it was straightforward and didn't require advanced navigation skills. Rain had been falling since early morning, leaving the ground soft and the wooden footbridges slick. Fog drifted in and out of the tree line, especially in shaded areas near the river. At 11:20 a.m., a pair of hikers heading back toward the parking area passed her near mile 5. They later told rangers she was standing on the trail, checking her map and adjusting the straps on her pack. She gave a small nod as they passed. Nothing seemed unusual about her pace or her direction. Around noon, several hikers farther up the trail reported hearing a short call from somewhere behind them. Because the area often echoed with voices from other groups, many assumed it was normal trail noise and kept walking. At that time, no one suspected it was a call for help. Later evidence showed that somewhere after mile 5, Kara stepped off the main path and moved onto a narrow side track known locally as a fisherman's path. These small routes often lead down toward the riverbank and can be hard to navigate when wet. The steady rain had made the soil slick, and the moss-covered rocks along the edge were unstable. Tracks found the next day indicated Kara attempted to climb a short embankment that connected the narrow path back toward the main trail. The slope was only a few feet high, but the mud showed clear slide marks where her boots lost traction. Rangers noted that the rain had turned the surface into a thin layer of grease-like mud. Downstream, a man fishing from a gravel bar saw movement near the river's edge at roughly the same time. He did not know what he was seeing at first, but he later told investigators he saw a person wearing clothing similar to what Kara had been described as wearing slip and slide down the embankment toward the water. According to him, it happened quickly, in one motion, with no sign of the person trying to brace themselves or turn around. The river was running high that week due to recent snowmelt in the upper elevations. The current moved fast, carrying silt that made the water cloudy and difficult to see through. The fisherman saw the person enter the water and disappear almost immediately. He shouted for help, but there was no one close enough to hear him over the noise of the river. By the time he reached the spot, only disturbed mud and broken vegetation marked where the slide had occurred. The fisherman walked along the bank for several minutes, but the river's speed and the limited visibility made it impossible to track anything moving downstream. A trekking pole, later confirmed to be Kara's, was discovered the following afternoon. It had become wedged between a cluster of rocks a short distance from where the fisherman reported the fall. Search teams followed the shoreline and used small boats when conditions allowed, but rain and fog returned over the next 2 days. The low visibility slowed the effort. Despite multiple ground teams, dog units, and river checks, no further sign of Kara was found in the immediate area. The forest stayed misty through the week, and the river level rose again, carrying more debris than usual. Several weeks later, river maintenance workers clearing log jams several miles downstream found fabric fragments and part of a boot caught in a mass of branches. Rangers examined the items and confirmed they matched what Kara had been wearing that day. Based on the location and the known conditions, they determined her death was caused by a fall from the embankment, followed by swift water submersion in the Ho River. The trail remained open, though signs were later added, reminding hikers not to follow unmaintained side paths during or after rain. Kara's route and timeline were reconstructed as accurately as possible, but the incident itself appeared to have lasted only seconds. It was August 22, 2017, when the ancient limestone caves of Mexico's Dos Ojos cenote would become a tomb for a promising marine biology researcher. Iris Thompson, a 28-year-old scientist from Boston, had dedicated her career to understanding underwater ecosystems. With 450 logged cave dives and advanced certifications, Thompson was known for her meticulous approach to safety and methodical research techniques. However, she harbored a secret fear, mild claustrophobia that she managed through controlled breathing exercises, a vulnerability that would prove crucial in her final moments. Thompson had traveled to Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula to collect water samples from unexplored cenote passages for her groundbreaking research on ecosystem adaptation. Her mission required penetrating 800 feet horizontally into the Dos Ojos cave system at 60 feet depth, carrying specialized collection containers and scientific equipment. Recent heavy rainfall had dramatically altered conditions within the cenote. Water levels had risen 6 feet, creating stronger currents and destabilizing limestone formations through increased water percolation. The normally crystal clear visibility of over 100 feet had been reduced to a murky 15 feet due to sediment stirred up by the storms. Local dive guides had issued warnings about unstable rock formations, reporting recent minor collapses caused by water erosion throughout the cave system. Despite these concerning conditions, Thompson pressed forward with her research timeline. Her equipment included twin steel tanks, pressurized to 3,200 psi, multiple dive lights, and her precious scientific sampling gear. During pre-dive preparations, her primary light began flickering intermittently, indicating potential battery failure. Thompson entered the flooded cave and began her methodical journey toward the research site. At 400 feet penetration, her primary light failed completely. This critical equipment failure violated the fundamental 3 lights rule of cave diving, but Thompson made a fatal decision to continue using only her backup lighting rather than abort the dive. Driven by scientific ambition, she pressed beyond her planned turnaround point despite the reduced visibility, also violating the rule of thirds for gas management. The cave seemed to close in around her as she swam deeper into the limestone labyrinth, her claustrophobia beginning to surface as the walls narrowed. At 750 feet penetration, the weakened cave structure finally gave way. A large section of weakened ceiling rock, loosened by weeks of percolation and storm runoff, suddenly broke free from above. The falling rock struck Thompson's lower body, pinning her legs against the cave floor and trapping her in place. The impact shattered 3 vertebrae in her lower back and ruptured her buoyancy compensator, causing immediate loss of buoyancy control. The falling debris also severed Thompson's air supply when it damaged her regulator's first stage, creating a catastrophic air leak that rapidly depleted her remaining gas. Trapped beneath the limestone slab with her legs immobilized, Thompson desperately attempted to reach her backup regulator, but her crushed spine prevented her from bending forward. The impact blasted silt into the water, reducing visibility to inches and making navigation impossible even if she had been able to free herself. Thompson's emergency air supply, compromised by the damaged regulator, lasted only 4 agonizing minutes. During this time, she made frantic attempts to lift the enormous rock, but her position and injuries made escape impossible. As her air supply dwindled to nothing, Thompson's claustrophobia overwhelmed her remaining composure. She died from drowning and crush injuries, her body remaining pinned 750 feet inside the flooded cave system. Recovery operations required specialized cave rescue teams equipped with pneumatic lifting equipment. It took 18 hours of dangerous work to reach Thompson's body and free it from the limestone trap. Dos Ojos Cenote was permanently closed to diving after engineers determined the entire cave system had become structurally compromised. Thompson's death prompted new regulations requiring geological stability assessments before issuing cave diving permits. On February 20, 2016, a regional women's Super G ski event took place on a competition course in Ore. The course was set up for intermediate and advanced amateur racers who competed in local circuits throughout the winter. Weather conditions were stable, with firm snow and temperatures cold enough to keep the surface hard. Race officials had inspected the track that morning and approved it for competition. One of the racers on the starting list was Sanna Holberg, a 26-year-old physiotherapy student from Uppsala. She was not a well-known athlete, but she had spent nearly 10 years competing in amateur alpine events. People familiar with the local circuit recognized her name from regional races. Her equipment and skis met standard competition requirements, and her coach checked her bindings and helmet before she entered the start gate. Course workers had built high snow berms, large packed mounds, along 2 of the sharper turns to prevent racers from drifting toward the fencing. Turn 11, in particular, was known as one of the more technical sections. Several volunteers stood near that turn to monitor conditions and maintain the edge of the berm. From their position, they had a clear view of each skier as they approached at high speed. Sanna launched from the start with an aggressive line. Timing staff recorded that she hit one of the fastest early splits of the day. She maintained good speed through the upper section and held a solid stance on the long, sweeping turns. Observers at the mid-course checkpoint noted that she looked steady and in control as she approached the steeper lower section. The incident began as she neared turn 11, where the course curved tightly to the skier's left. A section of the snow near the entry had become polished smooth from earlier racers passing over it. When Sanna shifted onto her inside edge to begin the turn, she lost a small but important amount of grip. Witnesses later said they heard her inside ski begin to chatter, a rapid vibration that made a noticeable scraping sound across the hardened surface. The loss of grip pushed her slightly off her intended line. Once she started sliding outward, there was not enough room or time to regain full control. Volunteers near the berm saw her angle change as she approached the packed mound faster than intended. She struck the berm nearly sideways. Her helmet made direct contact first. The force of the impact snapped her neck instantly and redirected her momentum. Several volunteers saw her body lift slightly from the bounce before landing a few feet away near the safety net. Her skis detached during the collision, sliding down the course without her. Sanna stayed where she came to rest near the safety net, showing no sign of getting back up. Volunteers positioned along the turn raised their arms to alert race control, and officials radioed the start gate to hold the next skier. Staff reached her location quickly, and based on her unresponsive condition and the position of her body, they recognized the severity of the impact. Racing was called off on the spot. Competitors waiting higher on the course were directed to head back toward the lodge, and workers used a snowmobile to cordon off turn 11 while they assessed the scene and secured the area. Later, race officials confirmed that Sanna died from a cervical spine fracture, the type of injury that occurs when the neck absorbs a sudden forceful impact. When she struck the snow berm, her helmet hit first and transferred the force straight into the upper part of her spine. The berm itself had been packed tightly by course workers, making it almost as solid as ice. Combined with her downhill speed and the sideways angle of the collision, the impact placed extreme pressure on her neck in a single moment. According to the medical assessment, the fracture disrupted the spinal cord at a high level, stopping all neurological function immediately. The injury was described as instantly fatal, with no possibility of survival once the force was applied. After the incident, staff closed the course for the day and announced that the remaining heats would not continue. The berm at turn 11 was reshaped and inspected again before future events were held on the same track. It was July 15, 2016, when the crystal-clear waters of Dean's Blue Hole in the Bahamas would claim the life of a promising young marine biologist whose passion for pushing human limits would ultimately become his downfall. Dashiell Ford, 28 years old, had dedicated his life to understanding the ocean's mysteries. A graduate student of marine biology, he spent his days researching deep-sea ecosystems and his evenings pursuing his true obsession, breaking human depth records. His colleagues knew him as methodical and quietly confident, traits that had served him well during 8 years of competitive freediving. Ford had earned multiple national-level podium finishes and was respected in the record-breaking community for his scientific approach to extreme human performance. For 4 weeks, Ford had been living in a modest guest house near Dean's Blue Hole, a site renowned among elite record seekers for its extreme depth and calm conditions. It was the perfect training ground for his ambitious goal, establishing a new human depth record exceeding 300 feet on a single breath using the constant weight discipline. His support team included his girlfriend, Sherry, a certified safety diver, Dr. Martinez, a sports medicine physician, and veteran record holder Tom Chua, who served as safety coordinator. The morning of July 15th brought ideal conditions. Ford wore a lightweight weight belt calibrated to make him neutrally buoyant around 100 feet. Safety divers were assigned to intercept Ford during his ascent at predetermined depths, following established record attempt safety protocols. Shortly before noon, Ford began his descent. His form was perfect as he passed the 100-foot marker in 45 seconds, entering the free-fall phase with arms streamlined above his head. Surface officials tracked his descent using line markers and dive timing. At approximately 330 feet, Ford touched the target plate and began his ascent, overshooting his planned depth. The return journey started normally. Ford maintained steady monofin kicks through the first 200 feet. As Ford passed 66 feet on the ascent, the safety diver noted his progress and observed early signs of physical strain. By 20 feet, subtle signs of hypoxia became apparent. His movements slowed, and the safety diver moved closer, shadowing him on his right side. At 10 feet from the surface, disaster struck. Ford experienced a loss of motor control, his body convulsing briefly before he lost consciousness completely. The safety diver immediately secured his airway and brought him to the surface within seconds, but Ford was unresponsive and not breathing. Dr. Martinez began CPR and rescue breathing on the platform while applying supplemental oxygen. Despite their rapid response and advanced medical training, Ford could not be revived. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived quickly, but it was too late. Less than an hour after the record attempt began, Dashiell Ford was later pronounced dead. A medical examination determined the cause of death to be hypoxic hypoxia, leading to loss of consciousness and respiratory arrest. A post-incident medical review and safety analysis later concluded that excessive pre-ventilation was a likely contributing factor, as it can reduce carbon dioxide levels and mask the body's natural warning signs. This dangerous practice, known as CO2 washout, had reduced the body's natural urge to breathe, a mechanism investigators believe allowed him to push beyond safe limits. According to the investigation, his recent training practices suggested increasingly aggressive breathing techniques, a potential warning sign that went unrecognized. Ford's death sent shockwaves through the extreme record-breaking community and reignited debate about safety limits in human performance attempts. In response, governing bodies issued renewed safety advisories and initiated internal reviews of deep record protocols and reinforced stricter intervention guidelines. The incident also prompted enhanced medical screening requirements for individuals attempting extreme depth records. The tragedy of Dashiell Ford serves as a stark reminder that even the most experienced record seekers can fall victim to the unforgiving nature of pushing human boundaries. His story would not be the last, as other limit pushers would soon discover that breaking records often carries irreversible consequences. It was May 28, 2018, and the rolling fields near Fredericksburg, Virginia, stretched under a clear spring sky, dotted with the white canvas tents and period equipment of a Civil War reenactment event. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully maintained battlefield replica, where dozens of history enthusiasts had gathered to recreate authentic military demonstrations. The smell of black powder hung faintly in the air from earlier firing exercises, and the sound of period music drifted from the encampment area. 42-year-old Maura Swick walked among the displays with obvious excitement, her enthusiasm for historical education evident in how she examined each artifact and listened intently to veteran reenactors' explanations. As a volunteer at a local history museum, she had developed a deep appreciation for hands-on learning experiences, but had never participated in a live reenactment before. Her colleagues had recommended the event as an excellent way to gain practical knowledge about Civil War military life, and several experienced participants had invited her to observe their demonstrations. The veteran reenactors had planned what they considered a harmless initiation prank for the newcomer. They intended to stage a fake accidental musket discharge near Maura, expecting to capture her startled reaction on camera while demonstrating the realistic nature of their hobby. The plan seemed straightforward enough, using a black powder replica musket loaded with a blank charge to create the dramatic sound and smoke effect without any actual projectile. However, the weapon had been placed on the ground earlier during setup, and due to the rushed preparation by an inexperienced participant, a small pebble had lodged unnoticed in the barrel opening. The rocky field conditions and casual handling of equipment during the day's activities made such contamination a predictable risk, though none of the pranksters considered this possibility while preparing the staged incident. The musket was loaded with a standard blank charge without inspecting the barrel interior. Maura was positioned approximately 10 feet away from the firing point, a distance the pranksters believed would provide dramatic effect while maintaining complete safety. The safety briefing she had received earlier made no mention of the planned staged incident, leaving her unaware of what was about to occur. When the musket fired, the expanding gases from the blank charge expelled the lodged pebble from the barrel at close range. The small stone struck Maura in the upper chest at close range, penetrating her torso and causing immediate internal injury. She collapsed immediately upon impact, and the observers initially assumed her dramatic fall was an exaggerated reaction to the loud discharge, exactly the type of response they had hoped to capture. The realization that something had gone seriously wrong came when Maura remained motionless on the ground. Her breathing became shallow and irregular as internal bleeding progressed rapidly from the penetrating trauma. The pebble had caused significant damage to vital structures in her chest cavity, creating injuries that were not immediately visible from the outside. Emergency responders were called when it became clear that Maura was not responding normally. She was transported to the nearest hospital, where medical staff confirmed the extent of the internal injuries caused by the high-velocity debris. Despite surgical intervention, the trauma proved fatal. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from penetrating chest trauma caused by debris propelled from a blank cartridge discharge. Investigators documented the failure to inspect the musket barrel before loading and the unsafe positioning of an uninformed participant during the staged prank. The individual who fired the weapon faced charges related to reckless endangerment and unsafe firearm handling during the activity. The incident highlighted the dangerous misconception that blank ammunition is inherently safe. Even without traditional projectiles, blank charges generate sufficient force to propel foreign objects at lethal velocities. The case demonstrated how seemingly harmless pranks involving firearms could have fatal consequences when basic safety protocols were ignored. It was August 3, 2017, in Topeka, Kansas. The temperature climbed to 92 degrees beneath a cloudless sky. The residential street sat mostly silent, except for the steady hum of cicadas and the occasional passing car. Lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically across trimmed yards, while heat shimmered above asphalt driveways. Bendix Spink, 42, a delivery driver known for punctuality and strict routine, had been mowing his lawn for more than an hour. He worked in straight, deliberate lines, wearing the same faded blue cap he wore every weekend. Neighbors described him as reserved but polite. For 6 months, tension had grown between Bendix and the man next door, Gareth Lyle, 38. Their conflict centered on repeated complaints Bendix made about vehicles speeding through the neighborhood. Police had responded to verbal disputes between the two at least 3 times. Neighbors later told investigators the arguments had become more frequent and more hostile in the weeks leading up to August. During yard work, Bendix followed a predictable habit. A clear gallon water jug sat on a small table on his shaded porch beside a metal folding chair. Every 20 minutes, he would pause, drink, and return to mowing. The jug was always there. 2 days earlier, Gareth Lyle had purchased antifreeze from a local hardware store. Surveillance footage confirmed the transaction. The product contained ethylene glycol as its active ingredient and, investigators later noted, did not include a detectable bittering agent. Doorbell camera footage captured what happened next. While Bendix worked in the backyard, Gareth approached the porch carrying an identical clear-gallon jug. The liquid inside appeared nearly clear, a diluted mixture of antifreeze and water that looked no different from what had been there before. He removed Bendix's original jug and replaced it with the substitute. The exchange took less than 30 seconds. He walked away without hesitation. After finishing the front section of lawn, Bendix returned to the porch. Sweating heavily, he lifted the jug and drank deeply. He paused briefly, as if registering a faint sweetness, then drank again. Ethylene glycol has a mildly sweet taste, something that can easily go unnoticed in extreme heat and dehydration. He set the jug down, wiped his forehead, and resumed mowing along the driveway. Approximately 40 minutes later, early symptoms began. Ethylene glycol initially acts as a central nervous system depressant. The camera footage showed Bendix moving more slowly as he re-entered frame. His steps were uneven. His posture slumped. He gripped the porch railing and attempted to steady himself before reaching for the door. His hands slipped. He collapsed near the welcome mat. A woman walking her dog witnessed the fall and immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transported him to the hospital. He was unresponsive but still breathing, his respiration shallow. In the emergency department, physicians noted unexplained neurological depression and abnormal blood chemistry. Laboratory results revealed a severe high anion gap metabolic acidosis, a hallmark indicator of toxic alcohol ingestion. Toxicology testing confirmed elevated ethylene glycol levels. Despite immediate antidotal therapy and aggressive supportive treatment, the metabolic acidosis progressed. Over the next 24 hours, Bendix's kidney function deteriorated rapidly as toxic metabolites accumulated in his system. Acute renal failure developed within the documented 24 to 72-hour window typical of ethylene glycol poisoning. He remained in critical condition overnight and died the following afternoon from complications of confirmed toxic exposure. Investigators secured the doorbell footage and reconstructed the timeline. Testing of the remaining liquid confirmed ethylene glycol. A search of Gareth Lyle's garage uncovered an opened antifreeze container purchased 2 days earlier, its contents matching the poison in the jug. Prior police reports documenting repeated disputes between the two men, along with the recorded jug exchange, established motive and premeditation. Gareth Lyle was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors presented surveillance footage, toxicology findings, and purchase records establishing deliberate poisoning. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to life in prison under state guidelines. On December 5, 2015, a winter skating showcase took place at a large community arena in Quebec City. It was an annual event that brought together local skaters, families, and young athletes from nearby clubs. The stands were nearly full, with about 900 people watching from all sides of the rink. The atmosphere was typical for a weekend showcase: steady music, volunteers directing performers, and groups of parents taking photos from the bleachers. Marielle Fontaine, 19, a university student who trained at the rink since childhood, was scheduled to skate with Laurent Gagnon, her partner of 3 years. The two had a long history on the ice and an on-and-off relationship off the ice, something well known among their teammates. Even so, they had been practicing regularly and had passed all their rehearsals earlier that week without any issues. Their performance was positioned in the middle section of the program. The ice had been resurfaced shortly before their turn, leaving a smooth surface without visible ruts or soft spots. The music began on time, and Marielle and Laurent entered the rink together. Their opening movements, jumps, spins, and step sequences, were completed without mistakes. To the crowd, it appeared like a standard, well-rehearsed routine. The incident happened during their side-by-side spin sequence, a move where both skaters rotate at high speed while keeping a set distance from each other. They began the spin cleanly, about 8 feet apart. From the stands, everything looked normal until Laurent attempted a correction in his balance. Several spectators reported that his right shoulder suddenly dipped, causing him to drift inward by about a foot. As he corrected his line, Laurent's skate blade swung closer to Marielle's path. A number of front-row viewers later said they saw the blade make direct contact with the left side of her face. The strike caused a noticeable cut, and blood appeared immediately. The blow also caused her to lose her balance at full rotation speed. Marielle fell backward with no chance to break the fall. Witnesses described her head hitting the ice with significant force, producing a sharp impact sound that carried through the lower rows of the arena. According to coaches and volunteers standing near the entry gate, her body went still the moment she hit the surface. Laurent lost his spin at the same time and slid toward her, coming to a stop on his knees. People seated closest said he shouted her name, but Marielle did not respond or move in any way. Blood from the facial cuts spread across the ice, but staff on scene later stated that her lack of response was more consistent with a severe head injury than with blood loss. The music stopped mid-track, and coaches rushed out immediately. Staff placed towels near her face but focused primarily on her head and neck due to the way she had landed. Observers noted that her breathing was shallow and she showed no signs of regaining consciousness. The showcase ended on the spot. Skaters waiting in line were sent back to the locker rooms, and the audience was asked to exit the arena calmly while emergency support continued inside. Only event organizers, coaches, and essential personnel stayed near the ice. Officials later confirmed that Marielle died from severe head trauma caused by the fall. The facial cut she received from the blade was significant, but was not considered the main factor. The direct impact of her head hitting the ice at high rotational speed produced injuries that were not survivable. After the incident, the organizers reviewed the entire program and removed all side-by-side pair elements from future showcases. The rink reopened for normal sessions the following week, but guidelines for performance spacing and partner routines were permanently updated. It was September 3, 2017, when the unforgiving winds of Royal Gorge in Colorado would transform what should have been a triumphant wire-walking record into a devastating tragedy that would forever change extreme human performance safety protocols. Cordelia Jones, 31, had spent most of her adult life defying gravity. The Montreal native had been a star performer with Cirque du Soleil for 7 years before a devastating knee injury forced her to reinvent herself as an extreme wire walker. Her perfectionist nature, which had once made her a sought-after acrobat, now drove her to push the boundaries of what was humanly possible on a steel cable suspended hundreds of feet above the earth. The Royal Gorge Bridge, stretching 955 feet above the Arkansas River, had become her obsession. The attempt had been publicly announced weeks in advance, with limited spectators kept outside a secured exclusion zone. For 18 months, Jones had meticulously planned every detail of her record attempt: a 1,300-foot wire walk across the canyon that would shatter the existing distance record. She had arrived in Colorado 6 weeks early, working alongside approved structural engineers to install a temporary rigging system anchored to pre-approved load points. Her husband, Mark, a rigging specialist, had designed the safety systems. Philippe, her former Cirque trainer, provided technical guidance, while paramedic Lisa Rodriguez stood ready for any emergency. The team had installed anemometers along the span, with strict protocols calling for immediate suspension if sustained winds exceeded 20 miles per hour or gusts spiked above 25. The morning conditions seemed perfect. At 6:15 a.m., Jones stepped onto the 1-inch steel wire carrying her 28-foot balancing pole, weighing 31 pounds. Jones chose to walk without a safety harness, believing that any tether would compromise the legitimacy of the distance record. The initial 0.2 of a mile progressed smoothly, with sustained winds holding steady at 12 miles per hour. Later engineering analysis suggested that as morning temperatures rose, the steel cable expanded unevenly as shaded sections warmed at different rates, a change investigators believe reduced effective midspan tension and increased sag. Jones adapted her technique, but the physics were working against her. At the 0.4 mile mark, the anemometer suddenly registered a crosswind gust spiking to 28 miles per hour. The wind caught her balancing pole like a sail, creating massive lateral torque that sent the wire into violent oscillations. Jones immediately lowered her stance, fighting to dampen the coupled lateral and vertical movements that threatened to throw her off balance. In that critical moment, her foot lost traction for a fraction of a second. The slip was barely perceptible, but at 955 feet above the canyon floor, there was no margin for error. Jones lunged for the cable itself, her hands making contact with the steel, but the oscillating wire reversed phase just as she attempted to grip it. Her fingers slipped, and she fell away from the wire, tumbling leftward into the void. After several hundred feet of free fall, she reached near terminal velocity before striking a rocky ledge below, before impacting a rocky ledge near the Arkansas River's edge. The canyon floor emergency team reached her location after a rapid descent, but the massive blunt force trauma to her head, chest, and pelvis had been instantly fatal. Investigation teams later concluded that rising temperatures likely reduced wire tension beyond planned operating ranges, making the system hypersensitive to crosswind loading. The gust that killed Jones had exceeded the 25 mile per hour threshold by only 3 miles per hour, but that small difference proved catastrophic when combined with the reduced cable tension. Royal Gorge authorities paused, permitting for similar high-risk aerial attempts pending review, implementing stricter real-time meteorological monitoring requirements. The incident renewed industry pressure for continuous tension monitoring and clearer suspension thresholds for long-span wire walks. On March 3, 2018, morning temperatures around Abraham Lake in Alberta hovered near freezing. Thin sheets of fog drifted above the North Saskatchewan River, and patches of ice along the shoreline showed cracks from the recent warm spell. The area was popular with early photographers who came to capture the morning light on the water. The trails nearby were mostly flat, but were known for unstable ice sections during late winter. 44-year-old Lydia Sorensen, a lab technician from Calgary, arrived shortly after sunrise. She often hiked alone on weekends and preferred easy riverside paths that didn't require climbing. She carried a camera bag, a small tripod, a thermos, and a basic day pack. She wore insulated boots, a winter coat, and gloves. According to a friend, she planned to walk a short section of the riverbank and return before mid-morning. At 7:15 a.m., 2 photographers setting up their equipment on a gravel bar saw Lydia walking along the edge of the river. They described her pace as steady, and she appeared to be looking for an open spot to take photos. The ice near the shoreline had a dull surface, showing it was thin, while sections farther from shore appeared thicker. The photographers said she stayed within 30 to 40 feet of the bank. Shortly after, the sun rose higher, reflecting off the ice and water. The temperature began to rise, though still below freezing. The river's flow remained strong under the ice, creating a hollow sound in some areas when stepped on. Cracks formed small lines that ran toward the bank, something common that time of year. By 7:40 a.m., the 2 photographers heard a sharp cracking sound. They turned and saw Lydia standing still on a patch of ice about 30 feet away. The ice beneath her feet sagged slightly. As she shifted her weight backward to step toward the gravel bar, a second, louder crack echoed across the river. Both witnesses later explained that the fracture occurred in a quick line extending outward from where she stood. The ice gave way in one piece, dropping her straight through. The opening widened as the broken edge collapsed under her movement. The water below was dark, fast and extremely cold. River conditions that week included steady flow from upstream glaciers and meltwater. According to the witnesses, Lydia surfaced once near the edge of the break. She reached for the ice, but each time she touched the rim, it crumbled because the outer edges were soft and could not support weight. The witnesses moved toward the bank while calling for help, but the current pulled Lydia beneath the downstream shelf in only a few seconds. Once she moved under the ice, they lost sight of her completely. The river carried debris and slush, making it impossible to locate an opening downstream. The two men continued along the bank, yelling and scanning for any movement under the thin ice. They attempted to look for air pockets or breaks farther down, but conditions made it difficult to see through the cloudy surface. Wind began to pick up, creating small ripples across the exposed water patches. Search efforts began later that morning after another group of hikers encountered the two photographers and learned what had happened. They contacted local authorities once they reached a location with cell coverage. Rangers arrived and examined the scene. The ice around the break showed clear fracture lines pointing toward the river's center. Lydia's tripod was found lying near the gravel bar, partially covered in slush. The next day, crews using poles and ropes checked every accessible opening along the bank. By then, temperatures had shifted again, causing new cracks and making the ice too unstable to walk on safely. The river's current also changed each day due to fluctuating upstream melt, which moved debris unpredictably. Over the following weeks, melting ice gradually exposed portions of the shoreline that had been hidden earlier in the season. Flooded brush and low water pockets along the riverbend collected branches, small logs, and articles carried by the current. Search teams continued to sweep these areas as conditions allowed. In mid-April, during the first major breakup of the season, river workers clearing driftwood from a downstream bend noticed clothing tangled around a partially submerged log. Part of a boot was also lodged between branches nearby. They contacted rangers who confirmed the items matched what Lydia had been wearing on March 3rd. Based on the consistent evidence, witness accounts, the fracture pattern on the ice, river conditions, and the downstream recovery, officials concluded that Lydia died after falling through weakened shoreline ice and being pulled under by swift water. The stretch of river remained open to hikers, but updated advisories were placed at the trailhead, reminding visitors that thin ice near the bank can collapse even during cold weather. Seasonal warnings were also added to local park websites to reflect the hazard conditions typical in late winter. It was June 8, 2015, when the unforgiving depths of the Gulf of Mexico would witness one of the most horrific industrial diving accidents in recent history. Rhodes Carter, a 41-year-old commercial saturation diver from Louisiana, had spent 18 years working the dangerous waters around offshore oil platforms. With over 2,000 commercial dives under his belt, Carter was considered a veteran in the high-stakes world of underwater welding and repairs. Yet beneath his calm, methodical exterior lay a troubling habit, an increasing tendency to cut corners on safety procedures to complete jobs faster and earn performance bonuses. Carter was 3 weeks into a grueling 28-day saturation diving contract, living in a pressurized habitat maintained at 7.2 atmospheres while performing critical structural welding repairs 220 feet below the surface. The saturation diving system allowed him to work at depth for extended periods without lengthy decompression, but it also meant living in a pressurized environment that could become a death trap if anything went wrong. For 3 days, the saturation system had been experiencing intermittent seal problems, requiring manual adjustments during chamber transfers. The transfer trunk door seals showed visible signs of corrosion and irregular seating during daily inspections. These warning signs should have triggered immediate maintenance protocols, but production pressures and Carter's impatience with safety procedures led to these critical issues being overlooked. Weather conditions had been challenging, with 25-knot winds creating 8-foot seas that delayed operations. Carter had been complaining about persistent headaches and joint pain, early symptoms that could indicate decompression sickness, but he attributed these to normal effects of extended saturation diving rather than seeking medical evaluation. The rig's diving supervisor had noticed Carter's increasingly cavalier attitude toward safety protocols, observing him rushing through pre-transfer checklists designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic failure that was about to occur. During what should have been a routine transfer from the living chamber to the diving bell, the corroded transfer trunk door clamp mechanism reached its breaking point. Carter was positioned at the critical transition point, surrounded by 7.2 atmospheres of pressure when the weakened door seal gave way completely. The explosive decompression was instantaneous and devastating. In a fraction of a second, Carter's body was hit with a catastrophic pressure drop from 7.2 atmospheres to surface pressure, a violent decompression no human could survive. The explosive expansion of gases inside his body caused catastrophic internal barotrauma as his lungs ruptured and arterial gas embolisms surged instantly through his bloodstream. The explosive force launched Carter's body against the steel chamber walls with tremendous impact, causing massive blunt force trauma. His lungs ruptured from rapid gas expansion, sending arterial gas embolisms racing through his bloodstream to block vital circulation to his brain and heart. His eardrums burst from the pressure differential, and his sinuses hemorrhaged extensively. The decompression shock damaged internal systems and left the chamber's communications inoperable, cutting off any chance of immediate assistance. Within seconds, the arterial gas embolisms reached his brain and heart, causing immediate loss of consciousness and cardiac arrest. Recovery teams found Carter's body showing unmistakable signs of explosive decompression, massive internal trauma combined with characteristic injuries of severe barotrauma. Investigation revealed a shocking pattern of neglected maintenance, with transfer trunk seals having gone without proper servicing for over 6 months in direct violation of federal safety regulations. The oil company faced $4.7 million in OSHA fines and was mandated to replace all saturation equipment across its fleet. Carter's death led to sweeping changes in federal regulations, requiring daily seal inspections and mandatory backup safety systems. His family received a $3.2 million wrongful death settlement. It was May 18, 2017, and the abandoned wooden storage barn behind a family farmhouse outside Cedar Ridge, Oregon, sat quietly in the afternoon heat. The structure, unused for years, housed only dust-covered feed sacks and rusted equipment scattered across uneven wooden flooring. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the weathered siding, illuminating particles floating in the still air. High in the rafters, a wild honeybee colony had established itself weeks earlier, their presence visible but largely ignored by the property owners. 16-year-old Leora Cade had arrived that morning for a weekend family gathering, her easygoing personality making her popular among the extended relatives who had assembled for the occasion. Known for her part-time work caring for children and volunteering at a local animal shelter, she had developed a reputation for being willing to participate in harmless jokes and challenges. What her cousins didn't know was that Leora carried a severe bee sting allergy, a condition known only to her immediate family and carefully managed through avoidance and emergency medication. Several cousins had devised what they considered a harmless scare prank for the afternoon's entertainment. They rigged a plastic pail filled with approximately 2 to 3 pounds of powdered livestock feed, additive above the barn's entry door, designed to tip when someone opened it. The powder, sweet-smelling and lightly dusty, was intended to create a visual jump scare for their phones. None of them checked the barn's interior or considered the possibility of the active hive in the rafters above. Leora was convinced to retrieve an item from inside the barn as part of a staged challenge, while her cousins positioned themselves at safe distances to record her reaction. When she opened the barn door, the pail tipped immediately, dumping the powder directly onto her head and shoulders. The falling container struck her lightly while producing a sudden noise that reverberated through the enclosed space. The forced entry, sudden movement, and impact directly beneath the rafters disturbed the hidden honeybee colony, triggering a defensive swarm. She stepped further inside, brushing powder from her hair and clothing. Her sudden movements in proximity to the hive were perceived as a threat by the emerging bees. The first stings occurred within seconds, releasing alarm pheromones that rapidly drew additional defenders from the colony. Multiple bees targeted her exposed neck, face, and arms as she attempted to retreat toward the doorway. Stumbling over the uneven flooring and stacked boards, she fell while more bees continued to sting. The confined space made escape difficult, and the accumulation of stings quickly overwhelmed her system. Swelling became noticeable around her lips and throat, and her breathing grew labored as the severe allergic reaction progressed. Her epinephrine auto-injector remained inside the farmhouse, inaccessible as the swarm prevented anyone from reaching her. She collapsed near the barn entrance as her cardiovascular system began to fail. Her cousins approached but were immediately forced back by the aggressive swarm. Two of them received minor stings before retreating to a safer distance, unable to reach her without protective gear. Emergency services were called while the bees continued to guard the barn. Firefighters arrived wearing protective suits and used smoke to disperse the swarm, before extracting Leora several minutes after her collapse. CPR was administered immediately, and she was transported to the nearest hospital but was pronounced deceased shortly after arrival. The medical examiner confirmed that death resulted from severe anaphylactic shock following multiple bee stings. Investigators noted that the prank had unintentionally created conditions that increased the risk of a fatal reaction due to both the disturbed hive and Leora's unknown allergy. The cousins stated they were unaware of her condition, and authorities documented the prank as a case of reckless endangerment, though no criminal charges were filed due to the absence of intent and the circumstances surrounding the swarm. It was May 21, 2016, in Savannah, Georgia. Warm air lingered over the historic district as evening settled across brick storefronts and narrow streets. Inside a renovated ballroom near the riverfront, a wedding reception was underway. Decorative string lights traced the perimeter of the dance floor, mounted along waist-high metal railings that separated guests from a slightly raised seating area. The space glowed amber under suspended bulbs, and the hum of conversation blended with music from the DJ's speakers. Cora Velt, 29, had ended a relationship 8 months earlier with Evan Maddox, 31. Friends later told investigators the breakup had not been mutual. Cora had begun planning a new life, distancing herself from Evan and eventually meeting the man she would marry. Evan, according to co-workers and acquaintances, struggled to accept the separation. He appeared calm in public, but continued showing up at places he knew Cora would be. The wedding invitation list did not include his name. 2 days before the reception, Evan visited the venue during business hours. Staff later told investigators he appeared composed and spoke briefly with a coordinator before asking to step into a rear service hallway. Security cameras captured him entering the corridor that led to storage rooms and utility panels servicing the ballroom. He remained out of view for several minutes. When he exited, nothing appeared disturbed. The lights along the railing continued to function normally. By early evening on May 21st, the ballroom was near capacity. The air conditioning maintained a stable indoor temperature despite the humidity outside. Guests stood along the perimeter of the dance floor, some resting their hands on the metal railing while watching. At 7:14 p.m., the couple began their first dance as approximately 30 guests gathered around the floor. Approximately 30 guests formed a loose circle around the floor. Midway through the song, Cora stepped backward. Video footage later showed her reaching her right hand behind her and placing it on the metal rail as she shifted her weight. Within a second, her posture changed. Witnesses stated that her arms stiffened and her body became rigid while in contact with the railing. She did not release her grip. Those nearby initially believed she had lost balance, but it quickly became apparent that she was unresponsive and unable to move. The music continued briefly before being stopped. Her groom moved toward her and attempted to pull her away from the railing. Upon contact, he immediately recoiled and fell backward onto the dance floor, conscious but disoriented. Several guests approached but paused, uncertain whether the railing was still unsafe to touch. Cora remained upright against the railing with sustained muscle contraction, unable to release her grip. Witnesses estimated the contact lasted several seconds before her knees gave way. When the connection ended, she fell directly onto the concrete floor. Staff disconnected power to the lighting circuit, after which guests moved in to assist. Emergency services were called immediately. CPR was initiated and continued by paramedics upon arrival, but no sustained rhythm returned. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be ventricular fibrillation due to electrical exposure. A burn on her palm and irregular circuit readings prompted investigation. The next morning, a forensic electrician examined the lighting system. Investigators found that multiple safety protections had been deliberately bypassed, allowing the metal railing to remain energized while appearing to function normally. The associated breaker had been obstructed, preventing shutdown. Toolmark analysis linked altered wiring to tools recovered from Evan Maddox's vehicle. Surveillance footage placed him in the service corridor within 48 hours of the incident. Investigators concluded the modifications were intentional. The ballroom closed temporarily for remediation. New ground fault protection was installed, bonding corrected, and the affected sub-panel replaced. Evan Maddox was charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued he deliberately disabled multiple electrical safeguards, creating a concealed hazard within the venue. Expert testimony established that the railing remained energized while appearing to function normally. Evan Maddox was charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued he deliberately disabled multiple electrical safeguards, creating a concealed hazard within the venue. Expert testimony established that the railing remained energized while appearing to function normally. A jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to life in prison. On October 2, 2016, early morning temperatures in Anza Borrego Desert State Park started in the low 70s and climbed steadily with the rising sun. The air was dry, the winds were light, and visibility was clear across the open terrain. The park's washes and ridgelines cast long shadows that gradually pulled back as daylight strengthened. By mid-morning, heat began reflecting sharply off the pale desert floor. 29-year-old Marisa Keene, a substitute teacher from Escondido, arrived at the trailhead around 7:45 a.m. She often took short sunrise hikes before the hottest part of the day. She carried a small pack with a bottle of water, sunscreen, a basic map printed from the park's website, and her phone. She planned a simple 2-mile walk to a well-known overlook and then back the same way. The route was easy to follow under normal conditions. However, in early light, the main trail and 2 nearby washes looked similar from ground level. The washes were wide, sandy corridors shaped by seasonal runoff, and many visitors unfamiliar with the area mistook them for trail paths. At 8:20 a.m., a couple heading back toward the trailhead saw Marisa approaching the main junction. They exchanged a brief greeting. One of the hikers later said she asked if the overlook was just straight ahead. They told her to continue on the main path. The couple then continued toward the parking area, leaving Marisa to proceed alone. As the sun rose higher, shadows that separated the washes began to fade. Tracks found later showed Marisa followed the wrong wash shortly after the junction. The wash curved gently away from the actual trail, giving the impression of a stable route for the first quarter mile. By 9:30 a.m., the temperature climbed into the upper 80s. The wrong wash gradually narrowed, and its sandy bottom became uneven. A hiker about half a mile away heard what sounded like a faint call, but could not determine the direction because the sound echoed off surrounding ridges. The hiker paused, listened again, and heard nothing further, eventually assuming it was either wind or another group. The later investigation found that Marisa recognized at some point that she was off route and attempted to gain elevation for a better view. The slope she chose was made of loose gravel and scattered rock. Boot prints showed short steps upward, followed by slide marks where gravel shifted under her feet. From the top of the slope, the washes below looked nearly identical, offering little help for navigation. Tracks leading away from the slope indicated she descended on the opposite side, likely thinking she was reconnecting with the trail. Instead, she moved farther into an undeveloped area that branched toward multiple dead-end rock formations. By 10 a.m., temperatures reached the mid-90s. Heat waves distorted long-distance visibility, making ridgelines appear closer or farther than they were. Marisa's tracks formed overlapping loops, showing repeated attempts to orient herself. If she attempted to check her phone for navigation, no record remained due to lack of signal and battery condition unknown. A shaded section beneath a leaning rock showed signs she had rested. The sand there contained a partial imprint of her pack, but she appeared not to have stayed long. From that spot, her tracks moved toward a tall rock barrier that had no passable route on either side. Beyond that point, her footsteps became farther apart and less consistent. The ground grew more uneven with patches of hardpan and loose stone. A small mound of disturbed soil near a dry shrub suggested she stumbled but continued forward. No signs of intentional shelter building or backtracking were found. Search efforts began in the late afternoon after Marisa failed to return home. Her car remained parked at the trailhead with no additional clues inside. Initial ground searches covered the established trails, but the temperature made extended searching difficult. Night conditions brought cooler air, but visibility was limited, and the open desert made it easy to miss signs from a distance. Over the next 2 days, teams searched the washes, slopes, and ridgelines, expanding outward from the last confirmed sighting. Aerial units scanned for color contrast against the desert floor, but rock formations and brush created numerous blind spots. 2 weeks later, a survey team conducting mapping work near a cluster of boulders found clothing and gear partially buried in wind-blown sand. They notified rangers, who located Marissa's remains nearby in a shallow depression formed by runoff from past storms. Based on the environmental conditions and evidence at the scene, officials determined the cause of death was exposure after misnavigation into an undeveloped section of desert terrain. The park later added clearer markers at the junction where the washes diverged and updated visitor maps to highlight areas where trails blend with natural wash formations during early light. The overlook route remained open, but visitors were reminded to carry detailed maps and avoid leaving marked paths during rising temperatures. It was November 14, 2018, when the skeletal remains of the USS Oriskany would claim another victim in the treacherous waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Tatum Wells, a 31-year-old dive shop owner from Mobile, Alabama, had built her reputation on pushing boundaries and exploring the most challenging underwater environments. With 650 log dives and advanced wreck diving certifications, Wells possessed an adventurous spirit that often bordered on recklessness, driving her to venture into restricted areas that more cautious divers avoided. Wells had organized this charter expedition to the famous aircraft carrier wreck to capture promotional photographs for her struggling dive shop. The USS Oriskany, sitting upright in 145 feet of water, offered spectacular diving opportunities, but also presented serious hazards for those who dared to penetrate its interior spaces. Recent storms had dramatically altered the wreck's condition, shifting massive amounts of debris and creating new entanglement hazards throughout the ship's corridors. Abandoned fishing nets and cables now draped across multiple entry points, creating a deadly maze of entanglement risks. Wells saw these obstacles as minor inconveniences rather than serious threats to her safety. Her dive plan called for deep penetration into the ship's hangar deck using only a single aluminum tank, a violation of standard wreck diving protocols. Even more concerning, Wells had decided to forgo the use of safety lines and carried only one cutting tool. During equipment preparation, Wells's primary dive knife became loose and eventually fell out completely, leaving her with no cutting tools for emergencies. When her dive buddy expressed concerns about penetrating unfamiliar areas without proper safety equipment, Wells dismissed these warnings with characteristic overconfidence. At 120 feet inside the hangar deck, Wells encountered the deadly consequence of the recent storms. A dense tangle of abandoned fishing nets hung unnoticed in the compartment. As Wells shifted for a better camera angle, her fin brushed the mesh, snagging her tank valve, and each attempt to pull free tightened the net around her legs and inflator hose. Wells's attempts to free herself only made the situation worse, as her struggles caused the nets to tighten around her equipment and body. The synthetic mesh scraped through her wetsuit, causing shallow cuts that immediately began leaking small clouds of blood into the water. Her frantic movements caused her to become inverted, with her head pointing downward. The entanglement pulled Wells's primary regulator from her mouth during her desperate struggle, and the twisted nets prevented her from reaching her backup regulator. Without her lost dive knife, she had no cutting tools to sever the nets. The fishing net material had also damaged her regulator hose, creating a rapid air leak that reduced her remaining air supply from 1,800 psi to 400 psi in minutes. Wells's inverted position made it impossible for her to inflate her BCD for emergency ascent, trapping her at depth as her air supply continued depleting. Her dive buddy attempted a rescue, but lacked cutting tools and became partially entangled himself, forcing him to surface for help. Alone and trapped 120 feet inside the wreck, Wells fought desperately against the nets as her air supply dwindled to nothing. The combination of blood loss, stress, and rapid gas depletion created fatal circumstances. Wells drowned after her air supply was completely exhausted. her body remaining suspended upside down in the fishing nets deep within the USS Oriskany's hangar deck. Recovery operations required specialized technical divers with cutting equipment and took 6 hours to free Wells's body from the extensive entanglement. Investigation revealed Wells had violated multiple wreck penetration protocols by entering without redundant cutting tools or safety lines. On December 19, 2017, an early morning freestyle skiing session was held at the enlarged competition halfpipe in Breckenridge, Colorado. The resort offered these sessions for advanced hobby riders, coaches, and local athletes preparing for regional qualifiers. The halfpipe had been groomed before sunrise, and the snowfall from the night before had stopped, leaving the walls firm and smooth. Temperatures were low enough to keep the ice hard, and visibility across the deck was clear. One of the skiers that morning was Maya Collins, a 23-year-old part-time ski instructor from Denver. She spent most winters teaching beginner lessons and spent her free time practicing tricks on the halfpipe. She was not a professional athlete, but she trained consistently and hoped to enter a regional competition the following season. Riders who saw her regularly knew she attempted complex spins and rotations even though she wasn't part of any sponsored team. Around a dozen riders and a few coaches stood on the viewing deck, watching people take turns dropping in. Maya completed 2 warm-up runs without problems. She moved smoothly through the pipe, performing basic grabs and spins to build confidence before attempting any advanced tricks. Nothing in those first runs suggested any equipment issues or instability. Her third run began normally. She dropped in from the right side, gained speed along the first wall, and lined up for a corked 720, a trick she had successfully landed only a few times during previous sessions. According to witnesses, her approach speed looked slightly slower than her earlier attempts, likely only a few miles per hour off, but enough to change the height and timing of her rotation. She continued toward the lip with a steady line, but as she launched upward, her rotation did not initiate with the same force as before. Multiple riders later said they noticed the lag almost immediately. Instead of a clean off-axis spin, her body rotated slower than needed to complete the trick. When she came down, she did not meet the slope transition of the halfpipe. Instead, she dropped nearly vertical toward the flat bottom. Several people standing on the deck saw the moment it happened. Maya's head struck the icy flat surface first, followed by her torso folding behind her from the impact. The sound of the collision carried across the pipe and caused a handful of riders to step forward. She stayed on the ice exactly where she landed, showing no signs of trying to get up. The snowboarder who had been closest to the impact called out to the staff on the deck, and several riders nearby lifted their arms to get officials' attention. People kept their distance while waiting for help, leaving a clear path for the coaches who hurried down the access lane. The halfpipe went silent as officials reached her. It took only a brief look for them to recognize the seriousness of the situation. The way she had dropped almost straight down, combined with the direct head impact, pointed to a major injury rather than a routine fall. Her helmet showed no visible cracks, but the force had traveled through it and into her neck, causing damage consistent with a high-energy vertical impact. The session was shut down as soon as the officials confirmed the seriousness of the situation. Riders walked back to the deck, and the resort closed the halfpipe to all guests for the remainder of the morning. Later that day, officials confirmed that Maya died from a vertebral artery tear, which caused rapid internal bleeding shortly after the impact. The halfpipe remained closed until the next day, while staff reviewed conditions and made minor surface adjustments before reopening it to the public. It was October 16, 2015, when a high school pep rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma turned fatal. The gymnasium held more than 400 students. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting off polished hardwood as music echoed against painted concrete block walls and exposed rafters. Rexel Mund, 17, was a varsity football player known as much for intimidation as athletic skill. Multiple bullying complaints had followed him for 2 years, none resulting in meaningful discipline. He thrived on spectacle, on forcing laughter at someone else's expense. 2 months earlier, he cornered Jonah Hale in the cafeteria, shoved him onto a table, and mocked him while someone filmed. The video spread within hours. Jonah, 16, was a quiet stage crew volunteer responsible for lighting and equipment. School records documented escalating hostility. 3 days before the rally, Jonah sent a message indicating that Rexel would not be laughing at the event. Due to the gym's high ceiling and suspended lighting grid, the school rented a compact articulating boom lift. The unit relied on 4 hydraulic outriggers secured by steel locking pins. Although the system used sensors to detect extension, elevation could still proceed if a pin appeared engaged but was not fully seated. Manufacturer guidance warned that incomplete engagement could lead to lateral instability under load. Security footage showed Jonah arriving early. Approximately 20 minutes before the rally, cameras captured him kneeling at the rear right outrigger. He shielded his hands from view while working near the stabilization assembly. Investigators later determined the locking pin had been deliberately tampered with prior to elevation, compromising the lift's mechanical stabilization despite appearing engaged. The pin was later recovered near the staging area, bent and marked. Students filled the bleachers shortly after 3. Rexel stepped into the lift basket with 2 other captains. Platform measured roughly 4 by 3 feet, enclosed by a waist-high guardrail. A brief visual check showed all outriggers deployed. From a distance, nothing appeared wrong. The boom arm elevated smoothly to about 8 feet. Music swelled. 2 students recorded from opposite sides of the gym. Rexel raised his arms and leaned back against the rail, hyping the crowd. One captain shifted toward him. The combined movement transferred weight toward the compromised stabilizer. Under load, the unsecured outrigger retracted several inches. The base dropped and pivoted. The basket swung violently sideways. Rexel was thrown clear. He fell approximately 8 feet, striking shoulder first before his head hit the hardwood. In the same motion, the destabilized boom arm clipped a suspended lighting bar that had not yet been secured with its secondary safety cable. The bar tore free and fell, striking him across the chest. Staff reached him within seconds. Emergency services arrived within 8 minutes. He never regained consciousness. Surgeons later confirmed fatal blunt force head trauma compounded by severe thoracic injuries from the falling lighting assembly. Inconsistent with accidental mishandling and consistent with deliberate interference prior to loading. Tool residue from stage storage matched markings on the metal. Prosecutors emphasized that disabling a critical stabilization component after reviewing manufacturer warnings demonstrated knowing exposure to a lethal risk in a crowded gym. Surveillance footage established Jonah's exclusive proximity during setup. The text message provided context. Investigators concluded the act was not impulsive sabotage, but a calculated decision to create instability under load. An outcome predictably dangerous, anyone elevated. Jonah Hale was arrested 4 days later and charged with second-degree murder. His defense cited prolonged bullying and emotional distress. Prosecutors presented forensic findings, the altered pin, and the message sent days earlier as evidence of intent. Following proceedings in juvenile court, he was adjudicated delinquent on the reduced charge of second-degree manslaughter and committed to a juvenile facility under state sentencing guidelines. It was August 18, 2017, and a desert wash outside Flagstaff, Arizona sat under the late afternoon sun. The dry riverbed, shaped by years of seasonal flooding, was quiet, with only sparse vegetation along its edges. Storm activity was building in the surrounding region, but the immediate area remained dry. The hardened soil cracked after months without rain. 27-year-old Tabor Flynn adjusted his camera equipment as his friends moved around him, joking and checking live stream settings. A freelance content creator known for endurance challenges, Tabor had built a modest online following by willingly placing himself in uncomfortable but controlled situations. What he did not know was that the group's latest idea had quietly shifted from a planned stunt into something else entirely. The original pitch was a fake buried alive prank meant to frighten Tabor briefly before an immediate reveal. He was told the box would not be fully sealed and that the burial would remain shallow and short. Without informing him, the group later changed the plan, deciding to enclose the box completely and extend the time underground to capture a stronger reaction on camera. They built a plywood coffin reinforced with scrap lumber and added LED lights powered by a small battery pack. Despite appearing solid, the structure showed clear flaws, including thin panels, uneven seams, and poorly supported joints. Ventilation relied on a single 2-inch PVC pipe connected to a small battery-powered fan that was never tested under load. The wash was selected for privacy and visual effect. No one addressed its role as a runoff channel during monsoon season. Although the ground was dry, storm activity was developing elsewhere. a risk dismissed in favor of producing more convincing footage. As the sun dipped toward the western mountains, Tabor climbed into the box, believing the prank would end within minutes. The lid was sealed, and his friends shoveled between 18 and 24 inches of dirt on top, far more than he expected. At first, the ventilation system hummed steadily, and his voice came through the radio inside as he laughed nervously, assuming the reveal was imminent. 20 minutes in, rain began falling, but not from clouds overhead. Intense rainfall upstream sent muddy runoff racing toward the wash. Within minutes, dry soil above the coffin absorbed moisture, transforming into dense mud. Liquefaction dramatically increased hydrostatic pressure against the box. The added weight of waterlogged earth multiplied the load far beyond what the thin plywood could withstand. The ventilation pipe became the first failure point. Mud clogged the opening, choking airflow despite the fan before it stalled completely. Above, saturated soil compacted, pressing downward with hundreds of pounds of force. The lid bowed inward, seams separating as shifting mud stressed the weakened joints. Panic set in as the group struggled to dig through heavy clay-like mud clinging to their shovels. The coffin shifted beneath the pressure, and a critical seam cracked open, allowing slurry to seep inside. Trapped with no fresh air and increasing compression-limiting chest expansion, oxygen levels dropped rapidly. By the time the group exposed enough of the lid to pry it open, Tabor was unresponsive. Emergency responders were called as the situation deteriorated, but efforts to revive him at the scene were unsuccessful. The medical examiner ruled the death the result of compressive and positional asphyxia caused by restricted breathing after ventilation failed and the burial structure collapsed under saturated soil. Investigators cited unsafe planning, reliance on a single ventilation point, and the decision to stage the filming inside an active runoff channel during monsoon season. While evidence showed the burial conditions differed from what had been agreed upon beforehand, authorities determined there was insufficient proof of intent to cause serious harm. The death was classified as accidental. Several participants received citations for reckless endangerment and violations related to unsafe filming practices. No criminal charges were filed, though civil liability remained possible. The remote location that had been chosen for privacy contributed to delayed emergency access. What began as a prank intended for online footage ended as a fatal miscalculation shaped by poor judgment and environmental risk. On February 21, 2016, winter conditions across the White Mountains were shifting throughout the morning. Clouds moved low across the sky, and a thin layer of frost covered exposed rock faces along Franconia Ridge. The temperature stayed below freezing, and hikers heading toward the summits knew that winds would increase through the afternoon. Light snow from earlier in the week had frozen into patches of ice along narrow sections of the ridge. 27-year-old Emily Park, an office assistant from Rhode Island, arrived at the trailhead shortly after sunrise. She often did solo weekend hikes and usually chose well-marked routes. Her plan that day was to climb Little Haystack Mountain, cross a short portion of the ridge, and reach a lookout before descending. She carried winter gear, micro spikes, a printed map, water, and her phone, which only received a weak signal in higher areas. By early afternoon, the wind picked up noticeably. At 1:40 p.m., Emily reached a high point on the ridge and briefly called a family member. The call lasted just over a minute, with her updating them on her progress. The signal cut out mid-sentence as clouds moved across the ridge. That was the last confirmed communication she made. The narrow trail she intended to descend followed the ridgeline before dropping toward treeline. The path was steep in places, with sections of exposed rock and patches of ice from previous freeze-thaw cycles. The trail became more unstable as the wind increased and visibility dropped. What happened next was reconstructed months later from evidence found during snowmelt. Based on the location of her recovered gear, Emily likely began her descent soon after the phone call. Investigators determined she approached a narrow, icy section just below a rocky ledge. The footing there was unpredictable, loose rock on one side and a sharp drop on the other. At some point along that section, she lost her footing. Slide marks and disturbed snow patterns indicated she slipped on an icy patch and fell down a steep, rocky embankment. The drop was estimated to be 20 to 30 feet before leveling out onto a lower slope. With visibility reduced by clouds and no other hikers nearby at that hour, No one witnessed the fall. When Emily did not return home as scheduled, she was reported missing on February 22nd. Search teams arrived quickly, but fresh snowfall that week covered most surface clues. Helicopters, dog teams, and ridgetop crews scanned the area for several days, but strong winds and shifting clouds limited visibility. No trace of her or her gear was found before winter conditions worsened again. For months, storms continued to hit Franconia Ridge. Ice built up and then broke apart repeatedly, burying and uncovering sections of the slope. It wasn't until late May, during a period of thaw, that a group of backcountry runners noticed bright fabric partially visible beneath receding snow near a drainage below the ridge. Rangers arrived the same day and confirmed the items matched what Emily had been wearing. Over the next 48 hours, as more snow melted, additional gear was recovered along the slope. Her remains were found farther down the embankment, consistent with the fall path suggested by the disturbed terrain. Based on injuries, weather records, and trail conditions, officials concluded Emily Park died from an accidental fall after losing her footing on icy terrain during deteriorating weather. It was March 15, 2016, when the crystal-clear waters of Belize's Blue Hole would claim the life of one of San Diego's most experienced technical diving instructors. Dorian Lane, a 34-year-old with over 800 log dives and 12 years of underwater experience, had built a reputation as both a skilled instructor and a dangerous risk-taker among his peers. His aggressive personality and tendency to push diving limits had earned him the nickname Cowboy Diver, a label that would prove prophetic on this fateful day. Lane had arrived in Belize, leading a small two-person technical team on a deep trimix dive, planned to reach 330 to 350 feet. The weather conditions were marginal, with 15-knot winds creating 4-foot swells, causing concern among the boat crew. Despite briefing reminders about exertion and CO2 buildup risks at deep depth, Lane insisted the dive would be routine and downplayed concerns from the crew. His dive plan called for 8 minutes of bottom time at 420 feet, requiring a complex 90-minute decompression schedule. Lane's trimix gas mixture contained 10% oxygen, 70% helium, and 20% nitrogen, appropriate for the planned depth. However, warning signs appeared during pre-dive preparations when his primary second stage began to intermittently free flow, a serious gas-wasting issue Lane ignored in his rush to descend. The dive team noticed Lane seemed unusually distracted and hurried during equipment checks, skipping his normally methodical safety routine. His dive buddy expressed serious concerns about the aggressive dive profile, but Lane insisted on proceeding as planned, demonstrating the overconfidence that would soon prove fatal. At 350 feet, increased breathing resistance and exertion from poor trim and descent control caused him to work harder than planned. This increased exertion caused dangerous carbon dioxide buildup in his system, leading to impaired judgment and confusion. His dive computer began alarming at 380 feet as he exceeded safe descent rates, but the CO2 narcosis prevented him from processing these critical warnings effectively. Upon reaching 420 feet, severe carbon dioxide retention caused Lane to become completely disoriented and lose buoyancy control. He began an uncontrolled ascent just as his free-flowing primary drained the last of his usable gas, leaving him desperately short on breathing gas and unable to access enough reserve air during the emergency ascent. Lane's dive buddy attempted rescue procedures, but found him unresponsive and ascending rapidly with his regulator out of his mouth. The emergency ascent became impossible to control as Lane, now severely CO2 narked and overbuoyant, lost the ability to dump gas fast enough from his BCD, sending him rocketing toward the surface at a deadly rate. At 200 feet during the rapid ascent, Lane's lungs overexpanded, forcing gas into his bloodstream and causing an arterial gas embolism that instantly shut down blood flow to his heart and brain. Frothy, blood-tinged fluid appeared in his airway from severe pulmonary barotrauma as expanding gas tore through his lung tissue. The gas embolism blocked critical blood flow to his heart and brain, causing immediate cardiac arrest at 100 feet depth. Surface recovery efforts found Lane's body showing severe signs of pulmonary barotrauma with no vital signs. Coast Guard medical examination confirmed the cause of death as arterial gas embolism, resulting from an uncontrolled ascent from extreme depth. The investigation revealed that Lane's carbon dioxide retention was caused by overexertion and poor breathing technique at depth, compounded by his equipment failures and rushed preparation. The dive operation was immediately suspended for 6 months, while safety protocols underwent a complete overhaul. Lane's death led to new industry standards requiring mandatory gas analysis verification and comprehensive CO2 monitoring training for all technical divers. His family's wrongful death lawsuit resulted in a $2.3 million settlement and the permanent closure of the dive operation. On October 4th, 2015, a weekend rec league hockey game was held at the Anchorage Municipal Rink in Alaska. Outside, the early fall air was cold and steady, with temperatures in the mid-40s degrees Fahrenheit and a light breeze moving across the parking lot as spectators arrived. Inside the building, the atmosphere shifted to the familiar chill of an indoor ice arena, where the air stayed noticeably colder than outside and carried the faint sound of skates scraping during warm-ups. The rink itself was a standard community facility with metal bleachers lining both sides, bright overhead lights reflecting off the ice, and a recently resurfaced sheet that showed clean, even lines. By the time the puck dropped, about 300 people had taken their seats, including families, younger players in team jackets, and regular attendees who often came to weekend games. One of the players on the ice was Evan Carver, a 29-year-old IT assistant who skated in the league on weekends. Evan had been playing since high school, but treated the sport as a hobby. He used older protective gear, including a helmet he had worn for several seasons. Teammates had suggested he upgrade to a newer full coverage model, but he often said those helmets felt too bulky. As long as he tightened the straps on his own helmet, he believed it was enough for the level they were playing at. The match itself started without any unusual problems. Both teams moved the puck cleanly, and referees called only minor penalties. Evan played defense and spent most of the first period covering his zone and clearing pucks toward the boards. He skated confidently and communicated with his teammates during line changes. The incident that ended the game happened early in the second period. Evan skated to the blue line to receive a pass from one of his teammates. As he reached for the puck, a defender from the opposing team moved in to apply pressure. The defender's elbow clipped Evan's arm unintentionally, something that can happen easily during close play. 3 spectators sitting directly behind the protective glass later described what they saw. The contact caused Evan's skates to slip forward, removing his balance completely. His body went backward in a straight fall. He did not have time to brace or twist, and the angle of the fall left his head as the first point of impact. When he hit the ice, his helmet shifted upward from the force. The strap held, but the older padding inside could not stop the helmet from rotating. This left a section of Evan's skull exposed as his head struck the rink surface with significant force. Evan did not attempt to stand up or roll over. Several players on both teams immediately signaled to the referees and bench staff. A few skaters moved back to create space around him, while others knelt nearby to check if he was breathing or responding. The referees stopped play right away and waved for assistance from the bench and the arena staff. The crowd grew quieter as people realized what had happened. Some of the youth players near the board stepped away, and parents in the first rows moved closer to see if help was coming. Evan remained motionless as staff evaluated him. His helmet lay slightly tilted on his head, showing how far it had shifted from the fall. The rest of the game was canceled on the spot. Players left the ice and returned to the locker rooms while staff remained with Evan. Spectators were asked to exit the rink so responders could work without crowding. Later, league officials released a statement confirming that Evan died from a severe skull fracture and extensive brain bleeding caused by the direct impact of his head hitting the ice. The force of the backward fall created a break in the bone at the back of his skull and produced rapid intracranial bleeding, which compressed the brain within seconds. According to the medical review, injuries of that type lead to an immediate loss of function and are not survivable, even with fast emergency response. Following the incident, Evan's team reviewed their equipment guidelines. They adopted a rule requiring all players to wear full coverage helmets beginning the next season, including those who had previously previously used older or partial protection models. The league also updated its safety recommendations for recreational players of all ages. It was June 9, 2016, and the rural roads outside Tulsa, Oklahoma stretched through rolling farmland under the intense heat of an early summer morning. The temperature had already climbed past 80 degrees, with humidity that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Scattered mailboxes lined the gravel and asphalt routes, marking the entrances to properties separated by hundreds of yards of pasture and woodland. The isolation that made this area attractive to residents seeking privacy also meant that help could be far away when emergencies arose, and passing motorists were few and far between. 38-year-old Roderick Jant had been delivering mail along these same routes for over a decade, developing a reputation among rural residents for his reliability and consistent service. His methodical approach to the job meant that customers could set their clocks by his arrival times, and his familiarity with the area allowed him to navigate efficiently between widely spaced addresses. The physical demands of the work kept him in good shape, though the summer heat made the long days increasingly challenging, and the quiet of the morning offered little distraction from the isolated rhythm of his route. Earlier that week, a local resident had captured a western diamondback rattlesnake that had been spotted near their property. Rather than relocating the animal safely, they decided to use it as the centerpiece of an elaborate prank targeting a friend who lived further down the route. The plan involved placing the snake inside the friend's mailbox, expecting to capture their terrified reaction when they discovered the unwelcome surprise. The prankster placed the snake loose inside the standard metal mailbox without any containment or warning markers. The confined space and rising temperature inside the metal enclosure increased the animal's stress and defensive behavior significantly. Western diamondbacks are naturally aggressive when cornered, and the hot, cramped environment made the snake particularly volatile and ready to strike at any perceived threat, its rattling tail a constant warning sign that went unnoticed by anyone outside. What the prankster failed to consider was the timing of regular mail delivery. Their intended target typically checked their mail in the evening, but Roderick's route brought him to that address during the late morning hours when the metal mailbox had already begun heating up under the direct sunlight, turning the enclosure into a sweltering trap. Roderick approached the mailbox from his delivery vehicle, following his standard routine of opening the door while remaining partially seated. The moment he lifted the metal lid, the agitated rattlesnake struck immediately, sinking its fangs into his forearm near the wrist. The bite delivered a substantial dose of hemotoxic venom directly into his bloodstream. The initial pain was intense and immediate, followed rapidly by swelling that spread up his arm. Tissue necrosis and internal bleeding began to set in, while the venom's disruption of coagulation gradually caused systemic hemorrhaging. Roderick lost coordination as the toxins affected his circulation, and his delivery vehicle rolled slowly forward into the roadside ditch when his foot slipped from the brake pedal. He managed to exit the vehicle but began deteriorating over the next hour. As hemorrhagic shock and organ stress progressed, the pain and swelling intensifying with every passing minute. The remote location meant that no immediate help was available, and his radio calls for assistance went unanswered due to poor signal coverage in the area. By the time emergency responders arrived approximately 18 minutes after the initial bite, Roderick was in severe shock. He was transported to the hospital where antivenom was administered, but the delay and intensity of the hemotoxic effects had already triggered coagulopathy, multi-organ failure, and extensive tissue damage. Despite aggressive treatment, the complications proved fatal hours after the bite. Investigators identified the prankster through interviews with neighbors who had witnessed the snake capture. The individual faced charges for wildlife violations and reckless endangerment, though local prosecutors noted the difficulty of proving intent to harm the mail carrier specifically. Authorities emphasized the predictable danger of placing a venomous animal in a location where unsuspecting people would encounter it. The case demonstrated how pranks involving dangerous wildlife could have fatal consequences for unintended victims. What began as a misguided attempt to frighten a friend ended with the death of an innocent man simply doing his job, and a quiet rural route became the scene of a preventable tragedy. It was May 22, 2018, when the towering granite monolith of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park would demonstrate that even the most solid-looking rock can become a deadly projectile without warning, claiming the life of one of America's most dedicated record seekers. Kai Mercer had always been drawn to vertical challenges. The 26-year-old from Boulder, Colorado, made his living as a professional rock climber and gear tester, but his true obsession lay in breaking speed records. His methodical approach had earned him several regionally recognized speed records on technical routes across the American West. The nose route on El Capitan represented the ultimate test for record-breaking climbers. This 2,900-foot granite wall had been conquered countless times. But Mercer's goal was different. He wanted to push the ascent below the 2-hour mark, shattering a record that had stood as the pinnacle of human achievement on stone. He had spent 3 weeks in Yosemite Valley, documenting every hold and movement sequence with his climbing partner, Jake Sullivan, a 29-year-old route specialist. Their ground support included Dr. Sue Kim, a 35-year-old emergency physician monitoring conditions from the base, and David Chi, 32, who served as photographer and official record witness. The plan was methodical. Use simul-climbing techniques with selective gear placements to maintain maximum speed while preserving essential safety margins. Dawn on May 22nd brought perfect conditions. At 5:47 a.m., Mercer began his record attempt with rock temperatures, ideal for grip in stable weather forecasts. His early progress was exceptional, dispatching the first 1,000 feet well under his practice times with efficient belay transitions that saved crucial seconds. The area was known for complex rope geometry and limited opportunities to manage slack during high-speed movement. Mercer was executing a dynamic sequence he had perfected through countless repetitions when the mountain itself betrayed him. A basketball-sized granite block suddenly detached from the wall. Subsequent geological analysis identified natural exfoliation processes that would not have been visible during inspection. The falling rock struck with devastating force, hitting his left shoulder and helmet simultaneously. The impact sent Mercer into a 15-foot fall before his protection caught him, leaving his shoulder badly compromised. Despite visible signs of injury, Mercer chose to continue the ascent, overruling concerns raised by his partner. Investigators later noted that symptoms observed shortly afterward were consistent with an evolving neurological injury. Jake immediately noticed the changes in his partner's behavior. Mercer's speech became slurred and his movements uncoordinated, signs consistent with a serious head injury. At 2,100 feet, while negotiating a challenging overhanging section, Mercer's weakened grip finally failed completely. The second fall was longer and more violent than the first. 25 feet of uncontrolled descent ended in a violent pendulum swing, Mercer's head striking the granite wall with sickening force despite his helmet. Jake immediately secured an anchor and halted all upward progress, recognizing that this was now a medical emergency. Mercer became unresponsive within minutes, his breathing shallow and irregular. The Yosemite search and rescue team responded efficiently, but the technical nature of the rescue from their exposed position complicated every aspect of the evacuation. The helicopter extraction was precise, but time-critical. By the time they reached the regional trauma center, CT scans later revealed severe traumatic brain injury with extensive intracranial hemorrhage. Late that morning, less than 5 hours after beginning his record attempt, Kai Mercer was pronounced dead. The cause was traumatic brain injury resulting from the initial rockfall impact, compounded by the secondary head trauma. The investigation confirmed what every record seeker fears.